Hi, and welcome to Comics Crash Course. In this video, I'll address a basic but surprisingly thorny question at the very heart of comics studies. What the heck are we studying? What are comics? Let's start really quickly with what comics aren't. They aren't a genre. Comics exist in the genres of romance, history, horror, crime, autobiography, science fiction, coming of age, western, comedy, erotica, magical realism, mystery, tragedy, epic, satire, and, yes, superheroes. For historical reasons I'll address in other videos, comics are often conflated with the comedy and superhero genres, but there's so much more than that. Comics also aren't defined by a single visual style. There are some styles that tend to work better for comics, again, something I'll address in another video, but any and every style can and has been used to make comics. Comics is what we'll call a medium or a form, like the novel, television, or film. It's a medium that tends to use words and pictures together. But this is where it gets tricky. What separates comics from other forms of media, like picture books, posters, or the heavily tattooed body of David Beckham, that also combine words and images to create meaning? In my experience, there are a few ways to construct a definition for something complex like a medium or a form. The first is what I'll call a checklist. You create a checklist of minimum requirements needed in order for something to qualify as that form. For example, in the early comic strip, David Kunzel writes that for an object to be considered a comic, 1, there must be a sequence of separate images. 2, there must be a preponderance of image over text. 3, the medium in which the strip appears and for which it was originally intended must be reproductive, that is, in printed form, a mass medium. And 4, the sequence must tell a story which is both moral and topical. He even gives numbered points, which is handy. Checklist definitions are useful because they're easy to understand and offer definitive yes or no answers. However, they're also pretty arbitrary. For example, Kunzel's definition would claim that if a fine artist created a one-of-a-kind piece that in every way looked and read like a comic, but wasn't intended to be reproduced, well, it's not a comic. The other issues with checklists is that it's not hard to immediately imagine a million exceptions to the rule. Checklists help us understand the normative elements of comics, but they don't really help us think about why those elements are common or what purpose they serve in the form. It would be like defining a house as a building made of bricks with windows, a roof, and 2 bedrooms, instead of saying a house is a place where people live. This brings me to the second kind of definition, the theoretical definition. Theoretical definitions attempt to do just that, explain the whys and hows, in addition to any kind of descriptive function. Perhaps the single most famous definition of comics, Scott Mccloud's, is what I would consider a theoretical definition. In Understanding Comics, Mccloud writes, "Comics is juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence, intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer." The use of deliberate adds an interesting element that forces us to think about the relationship between images, not just their placement. David Beckham's tattooed body, despite being a sequence of juxtaposed pictorial and other images, is not necessarily a deliberate sequence, so it's not comics. Mccloud is also referring to what scholars call authorial intent, and means that if an artist means for juxtaposed sequence to be read as comics, it should be read as comics. Mccloud's definition may be the most famous, but it's not without controversy. Its insistence on juxtaposition leaves one big empty spot: single-panel cartoons, like editorial cartoons, New Yorker cartoons, or pieces from The Far Side or The Family Circus. These have only one image, so they're not juxtaposed, there's no sequence. And for Mccloud, they don't count as comics. To be fair, other scholars and writers have written definitions that include single-panel comics. For example, Robert Harvey, who responded to Mccloud directly by saying, "The essential characteristic of comics, the thing that distinguishes it from other kinds of pictorial narratives, is the incorporation of verbal content." He even goes so far as to say that in the best examples of the art form, words and pictures blend to achieve a meaning that neither conveys alone without the other. This debate brings me to a third kind of definition, the pragmatic definition, which is the least scientific, but it's also the kind we use the most. A pragmatic definition is based on the daily and realistic use of terms rather than the theoretical or specialized use. Maybe the most classic example of a pragmatic definition is when asked how he would differentiate between obscene hardcore pornography and artistic nudity, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart said, "I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it." Maybe a little less is at stake when we say, "I know a comic when I see it," but it's no less frustrating for those of us who study comics to try and figure out what it is we're seeing. For example, Mccloud considers the Bayeux Tapestry to be a comic, but not the Far Side. But if you went to anyone on the street and asked which of the two was a comic, most people would probably point to the Far Side. So how does a theoretical understanding that makes sense clash so much with a common knowledge definition that also makes sense? I don't know that there's an easy answer to this question. In almost 25 years since the first printing of Understanding Comics, these questions are still being argued in the pages of journals and books and classrooms and YouTube channels. So you might have picked up on the fact that I haven't answered the question. It's not an accident. Quite simply, there isn't really a single answer to what comics are. I usually end up throwing up my hands and knowing it when I see it. However, I do think it's important to think about how we define comics anyway. There are a couple of reasons. First, definitions aren't neutral. We tend to fall back on dictionary definitions, as though they're proof of an argument. But this is only one example of how difficult it can actually be to explain what something is and how it works. Something as seemingly straightforward as comics. Everyone I've mentioned who has attempted a definition has their reasons for focusing on the aspects they do. For example, someone who I didn't mention is Bill Blackbeard, and in his Smithsonian collection of newspaper comics, his definition of comics skews towards newspaper-style comic strips, because he was writing a book about newspaper comics. When someone creates or relies heavily on a particular definition, think about why and how that definition serves their argument. Second, but related to the first, how you define comics determines how you trace the history of the form. In Scott Mccloud's broad definition, you can start the history of comics in ancient Egypt, even earlier. With David Kunzel's definition, you can't go back much further than the 15th century. When it comes to the nitty-gritty, I admit it's difficult to decide where the boundaries lie. And humans tend to like to have boundaries and categories. It helps us make sense of information. But for our purposes, frankly, I'm interested in all of it. Comics, proto-comics, pre-comics, comics adjacent things. I'll try to be clear when I'm addressing forms, subjects, and ideas that push at the boundaries of standard definitions or understanding of comics, but, well, it never really hurts to know more, does it? See you next time.